Hi guys. So for chapter 2, it covered a lot of material, not just about theories, but also research methods. And while it was just one chapter, this is really the foundation for the rest of the book, because if you understand theories and research methods well, then you can better interpret all of the research that's going to be presented in subsequent chapters on the content of lifespan development. So, with that in mind, I've broken up our research methods lecture into 4 mini lectures so you can take them one at a time and really try to digest the material well. So, our first research mini lecture is going to be on quantitative analyses in the psychological sciences. So, what does this mean? Well, let's think of an example. You're interested in how children develop over the first semester of kindergarten. So come up with a specific variable, this would be a topic that you're interested in investigating, and discuss how you might gather data on this topic. Now, since we aren't doing this in class, we won't be able to discuss this, so let me give you some examples. You could draw from any of the developmental domains. As you remember, the developmental domains are physical, cognitive, and psychosocial development. So one thing you might be interested in is how much children grow physically. So how much weight do they gain? How much height? What's their height at the beginning, at the end of the year? That would be a way that you could examine change across time in the physical domain. You also might be interested in a cognitive aspect like reading. So, how many letters can they identify at the beginning of kindergarten? How many words can they identify at the end of kindergarten? And finally, you might want to look at something in the psychosocial domain, such as friendship. So, what does the quality of their friendship look like at the beginning of kindergarten versus the end of kindergarten? Now, for all of these, you might be wondering, how do we quantify these issues? Because we typically use statistics to analyze data and come up with conclusions about these types of topics. So well, in the physical domain, it's very easy to measure a child's weight. That's something you can quantify quite easily. In the cognitive domain, the example I gave you, you could count the number of letters that they know, count the number of words that they know. But maybe on the psychosocial, that's a little bit more difficult. How do you quantify friendship and change in friendship across time? So let's discuss some important issues. Most research that we discuss in the book from journal articles. And journal articles, you can think of it as reporting straight from the horse's mouth. These are researchers, such as all of these people right here, who they conduct research and submit it for peer review publication. Peer review means that people who, with similar backgrounds as themselves, go through and analyze whether or not this is a article that's worthy of being published. So some articles are more prestigious than others. The New England Journal of Medicine is considered a highly prestigious journal. So something that's published here, people really find quite interesting. So this is what a journal article looks like. You'd have a title. You have the authors. You could look these people up, see what their background is, see what their expertise are. Typically, you'll see that the journal article is split up into an introduction, a method, results, and discussion. So 4 different sections. The introduction gives you the background that you need. It summarizes previous research. The method, that's the research method. So this right here shows us that they had over 1,000 infants. They were all the same age. They were randomly assigned. We'll get to that later in the lecture. To either be introduced to peanuts or not. And then they followed them up at a year and 3 years later to see if they had developed a peanut allergy. So this is a good example of research methods in action. For research methods, today I will primarily be talking about quantitative research. One of your mini lectures is on qualitative research, but let's first focus on quantitative because that's the type of research that we'll most discuss this semester. So quantitative research is objectively measured data. This means that you have standardized measures that are used. These are objective depictions of human development. And we'll also discuss what that means shortly. So, with quantitative analyses, with a quantitative research methods, your data is somehow made into numbers. This allows for analyses through statistics, which will summarize and hopefully predict what you're trying to analyze with your research hypothesis. This, with your quantitative analysis, it's easy to visualize because you can typically make charts and graphs. That's why it's really easy for people to understand, it's easy to discuss. And it also makes an experimental design possible. I have an entire mini lecture on the importance of experimental design if you're trying to assess causation. Quantitative analyses uses the scientific method. Now, this is nothing new. You have been using the scientific method probably since about third grade when you first had to do a science fair. So, this is the process by which we come up with a problem. We formulate some hypotheses based on our existing knowledge of the issue. We collect data. This is something that needs to be systematic, it needs to be rigorous, something that can be repeated. Then you analyze the data using statistics, you form some conclusions, and you share your findings. Now, sharing your findings is when you disseminate or translate the research. Disseminate means to publish, translate means to then move the findings into something that can be applied to directly help people. So let me give you an example. This was the study that I worked on for my master's thesis. It was called the Notre Dame Fathers Project. And we recruited first-time fathers and interviewed them when their babies were 6, 12, 18, and 24 months. This was done by recruiting through an existing study of mothers. So we identified a problem that we didn't know much about fathers. While father research has really taken off in the past 15, 20 years, previously people really focused more on mothers. So what we did is when we followed these fathers, we collected surveys, we asked them questions, but one thing that we did, a type of measurement, is we observed the fathers interacting with their children in the home. So we would go to their house, we would ask them to play with their child how they typically would. So we would say how you normally would play with your child for 20 minutes. Now you might say, but did they really act like they typically would? And probably not. They probably were on their best behavior during the video, but that's where we have something consistent across all of the videos. All of the fathers were on their best behavior. So we can sort of compare what does their best behavior look like. For this data, we would then have to quantify it, and there's many different things that we could have looked at. For example, we could have been looking at language development, and we could quantify the number of words, the number of different types of words that a father said. We could be looking at their approach to parenting in terms of discipline. We could be counting the number of times that they reprimanded their child. Anecdotally, I can tell you that there were some distinct differences in fathers. You could see some fathers who really their ideal fathering, what they showed the researcher, was interacting in a very stimulating, enriched environment. So these were the fathers who were talking to their child, they were describing everything their child was doing and seeing, they were using lots of rich language. And then there were some fathers who they felt that demonstrating good parenting or good fathering was showing that they were in control of their child. And these were the fathers that were more likely to reprimand their child, more likely to dictate what they were doing instead of following along with whatever the child was choosing to do. So let me show you an example of the scientific method that as it applies to the publication that I had from my master's thesis. So I told you we identified the problem that we didn't know a lot about fathers. I formed a hypothesis that their parenting would be influenced by their own experiences of parenting when they were children. I collected data, and this data was from 74 fathers where I interviewed them. I coded the interviews so that they could be quantified, so there were numbers associated to what they told me. I analyzed the data using an approach called structural equation modeling. This is a type of statistics that's basically regression, and formed conclusions that, in fact, yes, not surprising, but I found evidence that positive parenting role models and intelligence were related to working models of parenting. And so, with these working models, you can think of them as sort of schemas. So, what are your ideas? What's your parenting philosophy? And that higher levels of this construct called meta parenting, or this schema of parenting, were associated with better parenting. That's authoritative parenting. We'll be talking about that later on in the semester, and less abuse potential. So I was able to share these findings or disseminate them through this publication. So let's talk about what's important about measures. We use a lot of surveys in psychology, and when you're talking about a measure, you have to be sure that you have an operational definition, that you've really defined concretely what your terms mean. So, for example, I use the term meta-parenting, and you may have no idea what that means. Meta-parenting, I defined it specifically in my journal article, and it's, as I said, was a schema of parenting, or you could think of it sort of like metacognition is thinking about thinking, meta-parenting is thinking about parenting, coming up with parenting philosophy. But let's talk about another thing that might be hard to operationally define, and that's father involvement. So what does it mean for a father to be involved? You would need, as a researcher, to be very specific how you're defining that, because you could say father involvement is the number of minutes throughout the day that a child is interacting with a father. Another researcher might say father involvement is the quality of those interactions. Another researcher might say father involvement is if the father is just present in the child's life. And that is putting on the same level a father who is present but completely uninvolved versus a father who is present but actively involved. So we have to consider these different kinds of involvements. And I think that's just a really good example of whenever somebody's talking about something that they're measuring, you need to say, well, how do you define that? Because you might define it slightly differently than another researcher. We also need to be sure that our measures are standard and objective. So when I say they're objective, that means you've taken this subjectivity out of it, that regardless of what researcher is using this measure, they're going to all come up with the same conclusion, with the same final number. They're standard, and that's the idea that they're not changing from one person to another. These standard and objective measures are called psychometrically validated. And what that basically means is there's a lot of research, there's a lot of science behind these surveys. So many psychological surveys that you take, they aren't just made up on the spot. They can take years and years and thousands of work hours to be sure that they really are testing what we think that they're testing. So psychometrically validated questionnaires, they can be things like asking people yes/no questions. They often use Likert scales. Likert scales are things like from strongly agree to strongly disagree on a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale. How much do you agree with a certain statement? So, for example, you could be studying something like parenting and depression or child behaviors. For parenting depression, you probably would be asking the mothers to self report on their parenting and their depressive symptomatology. For child behavior, mothers could also report on whether their child is acting up. So you can see with this that you need to consider also who you're asking or where you're getting the measures from, because maybe it's better for child behavior to ask teachers because maybe they'll be more objective, or if you ask the parents, maybe you're more interested in typical behavior. Maybe children are on the better behavior in school. we have lots of measures of typical development in terms of cognitive, verbal, physical, social, and emotional development. There's lots of standardized measures out there. So, for example, we have cognitive assessments that we use. I put up an example on Canvas of the Bailey. I'll be providing some examples in class of that. And the Bailey is a child assessment where we can be sure that children have hit certain milestones, that they're operating at a level where we think they are. If they aren't, then we can provide a number, a quantity, to explain how delayed they are. For adults, a cognitive assessment, a typical intelligence test is called the Woodcock-Johnson that we'll talk about later. All of these are standard objective measures. So when I say, are they measuring what they think they're measuring, this gets into two topics that are easy to confuse, but we want to be sure that the measures are reliable. And when we say reliable, we mean that they're consistent. We also want them to be valid. We want them to test what we actually think that they're testing. So let me give you an example with weight. So say you get on a scale and you step on the scale 5 different times and get 5 different measurements. And each time it says that you weigh 15 pounds. This example it's reliable, it's consistent, but I'm fairly certain that nobody weighs 15 pounds, so it's not a valid measure. Another example that's often used in terms of validity, or it being a valid measure, in studying people in late adulthood, there was a study that was asking them if they were anxious. Now, this same survey was given to people in emerging adulthood. And what they found is that both an emerging adult and somebody in late adulthood could say, yes, I feel anxious based on this measure. And it wasn't actually testing what they thought they were testing. The people in emerging adulthood, when they said, I feel anxious, they meant, I feel excited, I'm eager, something important is about to happen, I'm anxious about this happening, in a good way. When they asked the people in late adulthood if they were anxious, they said, yes, I feel anxious, and they meant that they felt nervous. So the results were not consistent and they were not valid. For measures being meaningful, we need to also consider researchers' bias, that we are really invested in our research. We've put a lot of time and effort into it, and we have some strong opinions on how it's going to turn out. And so it's our responsibility to be sure that we aren't trying to interpret the data to fit our expectations, just because of this extreme amount of time and energy we've put into it. So finally, you need to consider your sample size. So for example, the study that I showed you from my master's, I had 74 fathers, and that's actually sort of a small sample size. For your sample to be good, it needs to represent your population well. I mean, that's what a sample is. We think that it is a smaller part of a larger population. So let me give you an example. If I asked everybody in lifespan development today about their attitudes on something, and then I said that my results generalize to all university students, I hope you see that, first of all, that's a class of 50. That's a pretty small sample to represent all university students. It's also not a random sample because you are in this class for similar reasons. I have a lot of nursing students. I have a lot of psychology students. I don't think I have one engineering student or one business student. So this is not a random sample. It's not representing all the different facets of the population, which is all university students. So we need to be sure that we have a large enough sample size and that it is a random sample that you can generalize from the population. So this information is a good foundation in research methods, and now you can move on to the next 3 topics, which are on more specific types of research designs.